My stepmother refused to pay $6,000 for my emergency appendix surgery because she had just booked a destination wedding in Bali for my stepsister. My father stood beside her and said nothing. My stepsister laughed and told me to take some ibuprofen and walk it off. They did not know that by abandoning me in that hospital bed, they handed me the key to destroy everything they had built. 2 years later, I did not just survive. I walked into my father's restaurant on its grand opening night and announced to 200 guests that I owned every recipe on the menu. But before I tell you how I took their dream and made it my nightmare for them, let me take you back to the moment they left me to die. If this story resonates with you, hit like and subscribe. My name is Adriana Reyes, and at 28 years old, I thought I understood betrayal. I had watched my father remarry 6 months after my mother's death. I had watched him give my childhood bedroom to my new stepsister, Heather. I had watched him sign over my mother's beloved bakery to his new wife, Diane, claiming it was for the family's financial future. But waking up in Houston Methodist Hospital with a ruptured appendix taught me that I had not yet scratched the surface of what my family was capable of. The pain had started 3 days earlier. I ignored it at first because I was working double shifts at a catering company, saving every penny for culinary school. By the second day, I could barely stand. By the third day, I collapsed in the bathroom of my tiny apartment, my phone just out of reach. My neighbor heard me screaming and called 911. The doctors told me I was lucky to be alive. The appendix had burst. Infection was spreading through my abdomen. They needed to operate immediately, but my insurance had lapsed 2 months ago when I lost my previous job. The hospital needed a deposit of $6,000 before they could proceed with anything beyond basic stabilization. I called my father. I had not spoken to him in 4 months, not since he told me that my mother's recipes now belonged to Diane and that I needed to accept my new family. But I was desperate. I was dying. I swallowed my pride and dialed. He answered on the 5th ring. I could hear laughter in the background, the clink of glasses, music playing. I told him where I was. I told him what was happening. I told him I needed $6,000 or they would only give me antibiotics and send me home to hope the infection did not kill me. There was silence on the line. Then I heard Diane's voice, sharp and annoyed, asking who was calling during Heather's engagement party. My father put me on speaker. I heard everything. Diane said that I always had to make everything about myself. She said they had just put down a deposit on Heather's wedding venue in Bali. $25,000, non-refundable. She said they did not have extra cash lying around for my drama. My father cleared his throat and said that maybe I should have thought about health insurance before quitting my job to chase some cooking fantasy. Heather's voice came through next, sweet and poisonous. She told me to go to a free clinic and stop being so dramatic. She said appendicitis was not even that serious and that people survived it all the time without surgery. I tried to explain that mine had already burst. I tried to tell them that the doctor said I could die. Diane cut me off. She said that if I was really dying, the hospital would have to treat me anyway, and that I was probably exaggerating to get attention like I always did. Then she told my father to hang up because the caterers had arrived and they needed to greet the guests. My father said he was sorry, but his hands were tied. He said maybe this would teach me to be more responsible. Then the line went dead. I lay in that hospital bed, staring at the ceiling. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The IV in my arm dripped antibiotics that the nurse said might buy me a few days. I thought about my mother. I thought about how she had spent 20 years building her bakery from nothing. I thought about her recipes, handwritten in a leather journal, passed down from her grandmother in Mexico. I thought about how Diane had taken that journal the day after the funeral, claiming it was a family asset now. The door to my room opened. I expected a nurse. Instead, I saw a face I had not seen in 2 years. It was my grandmother, my mother's mother, Abuela Rosa. She was 81 years old, small and frail, leaning on a wooden cane. Her white hair was pulled back in a bun, and her eyes, the same dark brown as mine, were filled with tears. She had flown in from San Antonio the moment my neighbor called her. She shuffled to my bedside and took my hand. Her skin was paper thin, but her grip was strong. She asked me how much I needed. I told her 6,000, maybe more. She did not hesitate. She opened her purse and pulled out a thick envelope. Inside was cash, more cash than I had ever seen her carry. I asked her where she got it. She looked away, and I saw shame in her eyes. She told me she had sold her wedding ring, The ring my grandfather had given her 53 years ago. The ring she had worn every single day since he died. She had taken it to a pawn shop that morning and sold it for a fraction of its worth. I started to cry. I told her I could not accept it. I told her that ring was her life, her memory of Abuelo. She squeezed my hand so hard it hurt. She looked me in the eyes and said something I will never forget. She said that rings are metal and stones, but I am flesh and blood. She said she had already buried her daughter, and she would not bury her granddaughter. She said my mother would rise from her grave and haunt her forever if she let me die over a piece of jewelry. The surgery happened that night. When I woke up, the infection was gone, and my grandmother was asleep in the chair beside my bed. Her left hand looked naked without the ring. I made a promise to myself in that moment. I would get that ring back. I would get everything back. And the people who left me to die would pay for every second of my suffering. Recovery took 6 weeks. I moved into my grandmother's small apartment in San Antonio because I could not afford my place in Houston anymore. Abuela Rosa nursed me back to health with her soups and her prayers and her stories about my mother. She told me things I had never known. She told me that my mother's recipes were not just recipes, they were a legacy. My great-great-grandmother had been a cook for a wealthy family in Oaxaca. She had created dishes that made people weep with joy. Those recipes had been passed down through 4 generations of women in our family. My mother had adapted them for American tastes, building her bakery around the fusion of Mexican tradition and Texas comfort food. Those recipes were mine by birthright, and Diane had stolen them. During my recovery, I learned more about my father's new life. Through social media and a cousin who still talked to me, I pieced together the plan. My father and Diane were opening a restaurant, not just any restaurant, a high-end establishment in the Houston Galleria area called Legacy Kitchen. The menu was built entirely on my mother's recipes, the mole that my great-grandmother had perfected, the tres leches cake that had won my mother a regional baking championship, the carnitas tacos that customers used to drive 3 hours to taste. They were stealing my mother's soul and putting their name on it. I felt rage unlike anything I had ever experienced, but I did not act on it, not yet. Abuela Rosa had taught me patience. She told me that revenge is a dish best served cold, and I intended to freeze it solid. 3 months after my surgery, I started working again. Not at a catering company this time. I got a job at a food truck, working 18-hour days for minimum wage plus tips. It was brutal. My surgical scar ached every time I bent over the grill, but I saved every dollar. I lived on rice and beans. I did not buy new clothes. I did not go out. I became a ghost, invisible and watching. I also started documenting. I found old photos of my mother's recipe journal. I found emails she had sent me years ago with cooking tips and ingredient lists. I contacted the lawyer who had handled my mother's estate and discovered something interesting. The will had never been properly executed. My mother had intended to leave the recipes to me specifically, but my father had rushed the probate process, and the intellectual property had defaulted to the estate, which he controlled. But the will existed, and the will was clear. I saved enough money to hire a lawyer of my own. Not an expensive one, but a hungry one. A young woman fresh out of law school who worked out of a strip mall office and charged reasonable rates. Her name was Jessica Chen, and she became my secret weapon. She filed a claim for the intellectual property rights to my mother's recipes. The case would take time, but the wheels of justice had started turning. Meanwhile, Legacy Kitchen was taking shape. I watched from a distance as my father and Diane poured money into the renovation. They hired a celebrity designer. They imported tiles from Italy. They bought a custom wood-fired oven that cost more than my annual salary. Heather's Bali wedding was postponed to free up more capital for the restaurant. I almost laughed when I heard that. Almost. What they did not know was that I had something they needed, something they could not replicate. My mother had never written down her most valuable recipe. Her signature dish, the one that had made her bakery famous, was a chocolate chili pie. It was a complex fusion of Mexican chocolate, 3 types of peppers, a secret spice blend, and a crust technique that required precise temperature control. She had only ever made it for special occasions. She had taught it to me when I was 16, standing beside her in the kitchen, watching her hands move with decades of muscle memory. She had made me promise to never write it down, to keep it in my head and my heart where no one could steal it. Diane had the journal. Diane had the bakery recipes. But Diane did not have the chocolate chili pie. 1 year after my surgery, I was ready to make my move. I had saved $22,000. I had a pending lawsuit, and I had a plan. I opened a small bakery in a forgotten corner of San Antonio. It was barely 500 square feet, wedged between a laundromat and a check-cashing place. The rent was cheap because the landlord was desperate. I called it Rosa's Legacy, after my grandmother. The menu had only 5 items, all of them my own creations, inspired by my mother but distinct enough that no one could claim I was copying. And then there was the pie. The chocolate chili pie. I made it the centerpiece of the menu. I priced it at $45. Outrageous for a slice of pie in a strip mall bakery. People laughed at first. Then they tasted it. The first review came from a local food blogger who stumbled in by accident. She wrote that she had experienced a religious awakening in her mouth. She wrote that the pie was worth driving across the state for. She wrote that whoever made this was a culinary genius hiding in plain sight. The review went viral. Within 2 weeks, I had a line out the door. Within a month, I was selling out by noon every day. Within 3 months, I had to hire my first employee. My grandmother sat in the corner every day, greeting customers, telling stories about my mother, wearing a new ring I had bought her to replace the one she sold. It was not the same, but it was something. The success attracted attention. Food critics from Houston made the drive. Magazine writers requested interviews. And then, inevitably, my father's people came sniffing around. Heather showed up first. She walked into my bakery on a Tuesday afternoon, wearing designer clothes that cost more than my monthly rent. She looked around with barely concealed disgust at my simple decor. Then she smiled her fake smile and said she was so happy to see me doing well. She said the family had been worried about me. She said they wanted to reconnect. She said that maybe, if I was interested, I could share some recipes with Legacy Kitchen. She said it would be a great opportunity for me, a chance to be part of something bigger. I smiled back. I told her I would think about it. I gave her a slice of the chocolate chili pie, on the house. I watched her take the first bite. I watched her eyes go wide. I watched her try to hide her reaction and fail. She asked me where I learned to make this. I told her my mother taught me. I told her it was the only recipe that mattered, and it lived in my head, not on paper. I told her no one would ever have it but me. She left quickly after that. I knew she would report back to Diane. I knew they would come for me eventually. Legacy Kitchen opened 6 months later to massive fanfare. The Houston Chronicle called it the most anticipated restaurant of the year. The menu featured my mother's recipes, presented with expensive ingredients and pretentious descriptions. My father gave interviews about honoring his late wife's legacy. Diane smiled for photos in the kitchen she had never worked in. Heather posted selfies with dishes she could not pronounce. Opening night was a gala. 200 of Houston's elite, paying $500 a plate. My father had invited investors, critics, influencers, everyone who mattered. He had even hired a PR firm to manage the press coverage. What he had not anticipated was my lawsuit reaching its conclusion. Jessica Chen called me the morning of the opening. The judge had ruled in my favor. The intellectual property rights to my mother's recipes belonged to me. Every single one. The ruling also included a provision for damages, compensation for the unauthorized commercial use of the recipes over the past 2 years. I put on my best dress. It was red, the color my mother always said looked powerful on me. I did my makeup carefully. I styled my hair the way Abuela Rosa had taught me. I looked in the mirror and saw my mother looking back. I drove to Houston. I parked 3 blocks from the restaurant and walked. The evening air was warm, and the city lights reflected off the glass towers downtown. I could see the crowd outside Legacy Kitchen, photographers snapping pictures of arriving guests. I walked past the velvet rope. The bouncer tried to stop me, but I told him my name was Adriana Reyes, and I was on the guest list. He checked. I was not on the list. But before he could turn me away, I pulled out my phone and showed him the court document. I told him I was the owner of every recipe being served inside, and if he did not let me in, I would have the health department shut down the kitchen within the hour for intellectual property violation. He let me in. The restaurant was beautiful, I had to admit that. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings. White tablecloths covered every surface. The smell of my mother's food filled the air, corrupted by too much butter and not enough soul. I walked through the crowd, my heels clicking on the polished floor. Heads turned, people whispered. My father saw me first. He was standing by the bar, holding a champagne flute, laughing at something an investor had said. His laughter died when our eyes met. His face went pale. He looked at Diane, who was across the room, and something passed between them. Fear. I walked to the center of the dining room. I climbed onto a small platform that had been set up for speeches. I picked up the microphone. The room went silent. I introduced myself. I said my name was Adriana Reyes. I said I was the daughter of Maria Reyes, the woman whose recipes were being served tonight. I said I had a message for everyone in the room. Diane was pushing through the crowd, her face twisted with fury. My father was frozen in place. Heather was recording on her phone, probably thinking she would capture my humiliation. I held up the court document. I explained that as of 9 o'clock that morning, I was the legal owner of every recipe on the Legacy Kitchen menu. I explained that any commercial use of those recipes without my permission was now illegal. I explained that the restaurant had two choices: pay me licensing fees for every dish served, or change the entire menu immediately. The room erupted. Investors shouted questions. Critics scribbled notes. Photographers captured everything. Diane reached the platform and grabbed my arm. She hissed at me to stop, to think about what I was doing, to remember that she was still my stepmother. I looked at her hand on my arm. I looked at her face, the face that had told my father to hang up while I was dying. I leaned into the microphone. I said that 2 years ago, I was in a hospital bed, with a ruptured appendix. I said I called my father for help, and this woman told him to hang up because she had a party to attend. I said she let me almost die so she could book a wedding venue. I said she stole my mother's legacy and thought she could erase me from existence. The room was dead silent. Every eye was on Diane. Her grip on my arm loosened. She stepped back, looking around at the crowd, realizing that her reputation was crumbling in real time. My father finally found his voice. He stepped forward and tried to explain. He said it was a misunderstanding. He said they thought I was exaggerating. He said they did not know how serious it was. I pulled out my phone and played a recording. I had recorded that call 2 years ago. I did not know why at the time, maybe instinct, maybe my mother watching over me, but I had it, and now everyone heard it. They heard Diane say I was being dramatic. They heard Heather say to take ibuprofen. They heard my father say his hands were tied. The recording ended. The silence was suffocating. I stepped down from the platform. I told the crowd that I was not here to destroy my father. I was here to reclaim what was mine. I said that Legacy Kitchen could continue to operate, but only under a licensing agreement with me. 50% of all profits would go to a scholarship fund in my mother's name. The restaurant would be renamed Maria's Legacy, and my grandmother, Rosa Reyes, would have a permanent seat at the chef's table, free of charge, for the rest of her life. I turned to my father. I told him he had 48 hours to sign the agreement or I would pursue full damages, which my lawyer estimated at over $2 million. Then I walked out. I did not look back. 2 days later, my father signed. He had no choice. The investors were threatening to pull out. The press coverage had been devastating. Diane had already filed for divorce, trying to distance herself from the scandal. Heather's influencer career was over, her followers abandoning her after the recording went viral. 6 months later, I stood in the dining room of Maria's Legacy. The restaurant had been transformed. Gone were the pretentious decorations and overpriced dishes. In their place was warmth, color, the spirit of my mother's original bakery. Abuela Rosa sat in her chair by the window, wearing the ring I had finally been able to buy back from the pawn shop. It had cost me 3 times what she had sold it for. But some things are beyond price. The chocolate chili pill was on the menu now, sold exclusively here. It was priced at $20 a slice, reasonable and accessible, the way my mother would have wanted. We sold out every night. I looked around the room at the diners, the families celebrating birthdays, the couples on dates, the old friends catching up. I thought about my mother. I thought about what she would say if she could see this. My phone buzzed. It was a text from my father. He had sent them occasionally over the past months. always apologizing, always asking to talk. I had not responded to any of them. But today, something felt different. Today, I felt strong enough. I typed back a single word. Okay. We met for coffee the next week. He looked older, diminished. He cried and told me he was sorry. He said he had been weak, that Diane had controlled him, that he had lost himself after my mother died. I listened. I did not forgive him. Forgiveness was not something I was ready to give. But I told him the door was not completely closed. I told him he could earn his way back, one action at a time. He asked what he could do. I told him to volunteer at the Scholarship Foundation. I told him to visit Abuela Rosa. I told him to learn the recipes properly, to understand what my mother had created, to respect her memory the way he should have from the beginning. He agreed. Whether he will follow through, I do not know. But that is not my burden anymore. I walked back to the restaurant after our meeting. The evening rush was starting. The kitchen was alive with the sounds of sizzling pans and shouted orders. I tied on my apron and took my place at the stove. My mother's recipes lived on. My grandmother was safe and happy. My father was facing the consequences of his choices. And I, Adriana Reyes, was exactly where I belonged. They thought they could erase me. They thought a hospital bill and a stolen journal would be enough to make me disappear. They were wrong. Some legacies cannot be stolen. Some recipes cannot be written down. Some daughters refuse to be forgotten. This story reminds us that the people who should protect us sometimes become the ones who hurt us most. But it also shows that family is not just blood. Family is the grandmother who sells her wedding ring. Family is the lawyer who believes in your case. Family is everyone who stands by you when the people who should have abandoned you instead. If Adriana's story inspired you to keep fighting for what is rightfully yours, please like this video and subscribe to Pie Revenge. Share this with someone who needs to know that their legacy matters. And remember, the best revenge is not destruction, it is success.